Stand up. Give your seat to her. She will sit here.
3 years after becoming Duchess of Ashcroft Hall, Eleanor Whitmore lost her place beside her husband with one quiet command. It happened during the most important dinner of the winter season. Beneath crystal chandeliers and candlelight, surrounded by relatives who had spent years waiting for her to fail, Duke Edward Ashcroft looked at his wife and said, "Stand up." Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes from her plate. For a brief moment, she believed she had misunderstood him. Edward's expression remained calm. Then he continued, "Lady Beatrice has just returned from France. Let her take this seat." Tonight, the room fell silent. Not because there were no other chairs. There were plenty. The silence came because everyone understood what had just been taken from Eleanor. It wasn't simply a seat. It was the place beside her husband, the place reserved for the Duchess, the place she had occupied faithfully for 3 years. Eleanor rose without protest. She did not cry or question him. She simply stepped aside while Lady Beatrice lowered herself gracefully into the empty chair, looking as though she had finally returned to where she belonged. No one realized then that this dinner would change everything. Eleanor had never married Edward for love. Their union had been practical. Her family's fortunes had declined while Edward, despite his title and wealth, had become increasingly isolated. After the woman everyone expected him to marry chose another future, society considered it an unfortunate arrangement. A quiet girl from a struggling family. A distant duke who inspired respect more easily than affection. Yet Eleanor had accepted his proposal because she saw something others overlooked. Edward paid elderly servants before indulging his own comforts. He remembered the names of tenant widows. He disliked receiving praise for kindness he considered ordinary. Beneath the reserve and rigid manners, Eleanor discovered a good man who had forgotten how to let people close. She believed patience could bridge the distance between them. Perhaps that had been her greatest mistake. Ashcroft Hall had never welcomed her easily. Lady Margaret, Edward's elder sister, tolerated Eleanor with flawless politeness sharpened into criticism. "You've adapted remarkably well," she once remarked. "For someone unfamiliar with ducal society." Eleanor smiled. "Fortunately, kindness seems welcome everywhere." Margaret returned the smile. "You'll discover that kindness isn't always enough." Edward never joined his family's mockery. That was what made everything complicated. He trusted Eleanor with household matters. He thanked her for correcting estate accounts and listened when she proposed improvements. Yet whenever his family belittled her, he chose silence. Eleanor told herself he disliked conflict. She told herself he trusted her strength. She told herself many things because loving someone often meant explaining away the disappointments you weren't ready to confront. Over time, Ashcroft Hall slowly changed around her. The servants adored her because she remembered their worries and eased their burdens whenever she could. She improved working conditions throughout the household without seeking praise. The village school received books. The infirmary received medicine. Widows found unexpected support. The villagers stopped calling her Duchess. They began calling her Eleanor. Edward noticed. Sometimes she caught him watching her across the breakfast table with an unreadable expression. Those moments kept hope alive. There were other signs too. After Eleanor spent an afternoon delivering medicine during heavy rain, a physician arrived unexpectedly at Ashcroft Hall. "His Grace requested I examine you," the doctor explained. At dinner, Edward remained behind his newspaper. "Did the physician inconvenience you?" he asked. Another time, Eleanor mentioned missing the rose garden from her childhood home. Several weeks later, gardeners restored the neglected West Gardens. Edward never acknowledged arranging it. He didn't need to. For a while, small gestures felt like enough. Then Lady Beatrice Harrow returned. Years before Eleanor entered Edward's life, Beatrice had been the woman everyone expected him to marry. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and perfectly suited to the Ashcroft name. Before war and disappointment hardened Edward, they had shared an understanding that bordered on certainty. Then Beatrice left England. No one discussed it openly, but Edward's family remembered. Especially Margaret. "I hear Lady Beatrice is even lovelier than before," one cousin remarked during luncheon. Margaret glanced toward Eleanor. "Some women possess elegance that time never diminishes." Another relative laughed softly. Edward admired her greatly. Eleanor continued pouring tea. Her hand remained steady. Across the table, Edward simply changed the subject. Later that evening, Mrs. Bell approached Eleanor. Lady Margaret altered the seating arrangements for the winter dinner. Eleanor looked up. How? Lady Beatrice has been placed beside His Grace. Silence settled between them. Finally, Eleanor folded the guest list. It can be corrected. Shall I inform His Grace? Eleanor lowered her gaze. No. It's only a seating arrangement. But even as she spoke, neither woman truly believed it. That night, Edward found Eleanor in the library. Margaret tells me Beatrice will attend the dinner. So I've heard. He hesitated. Does that trouble you? It was a dangerous question because honesty required trust. Eleanor closed the book in her lap. Should it? Edward studied her, then answered quietly. No. She waited. Nothing followed. At last she offered him a faint smile. Then I shall make certain she feels welcome. 3 nights later, the winter dinner began. Snow covered the grounds beyond Ashcroft Hall. Candles illuminated every corridor. While the dining room glowed with warmth, Eleanor herself had carefully arranged. She had selected the menus and flowers. She wore a deep blue gown Edward had once admired. Though she disliked admitting it, she still cared whether he noticed. He did. She saw it in the way his gaze lingered as she entered the drawing room. Then the butler announced another arrival. Lady Beatrice Harrow. Beatrice entered effortlessly. Golden silk, pearls woven through dark hair, a smile polished by years of admiration. The room brightened around her. Edward became very still. Margaret looked pleased. The servants stiffened. Beatrice approached Edward first. Your Grace. It's been far too long. Edward bowed politely. Lady Beatrice. Only then did she turn toward Eleanor. And this must be your Duchess. Not Lady Ashcroft, not your wife, your Duchess. As though Eleanor were merely an accessory acquired during Beatrice's absence. Eleanor smiled with practiced grace. Welcome to Ashcroft Hall, Lady Beatrice. Dinner began. For the first course, nothing happened. Then Margaret sighed. It's unfortunate Lady Beatrice sits so far from Edward after all these years. One cousin offered to exchange places. Beatrice laughed softly. I'm perfectly comfortable where I am. The room waited. Edward remained silent. Then Margaret turned toward her brother. Surely Lady Beatrice deserves a warmer welcome. Edward looked toward Beatrice, then toward Eleanor. Discomfort crossed his face. Eleanor expected him to dismiss the suggestion. Instead, he set down his glass. Then looked directly at her. Stand up. The words struck harder than shouting ever could. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. Edward? She whispered. His jaw tightened. Lady Beatrice has just returned from France. Let her take this seat tonight. Silence swallowed the room. Eleanor understood then that the chair itself had never been the true wound. The wound was that her husband had asked her to surrender it. The wound was realizing that after 3 years beside him, he still didn't understand what that place had meant to her. Slowly, Eleanor rose. Of course, Your Grace. Edward flinched. Not because she obeyed, because she addressed him by title. Beatrice moved gracefully into the Duchess's chair. Eleanor accepted an empty seat farther down the table. The dinner continued. Because families like the Ashcrofts knew how to continue through humiliation, as long as the silver remained polished. Eleanor smiled when spoken to, answered questions, maintained perfect composure, but somewhere deep inside her heart, something quietly stepped away. Across the table, Edward looked toward her only once. Eleanor met his gaze, then calmly looked away. And for reasons he could not yet understand, that frightened him more than tears ever could. Eleanor did not leave Ashcroft Hall that night. She finished the dinner she had planned and thanked each guest with the same grace she had shown throughout 3 years as Duchess of Ashcroft Hall. She wished the elderly relatives a pleasant evening before retiring quietly to her rooms. No, one who watched her leave would have guessed that she had finally stopped hoping. The following morning, life inside Ashcroft Hall continued exactly as it always had. Breakfast was served. Letters arrived from London. Servants polished silver. Only Eleanor had changed. For the first time since their marriage, she stopped making excuses for her husband. She no longer told herself that Edward disliked conflict, or that silence was simply another form of love. The truth had become impossible to ignore. A man who understood what she meant to him would never have asked her to surrender her place beside him. At breakfast, Edward entered the dining room expecting routine. Instead, he found Eleanor seated at the far end of the table reviewing correspondence. You may sit here. he said quietly. Eleanor looked up. Thank you. Your Grace. I'm comfortable where I am. The title unsettled him. You don't need to call me that. She folded another letter. What would you prefer I call you? For the first time in years, Edward found himself without an answer. Over the following days, Eleanor continued fulfilling her duties with flawless efficiency. She visited the village school, met with tenants, and reviewed household accounts. She smiled at servants and thanked them for their work, but she no longer waited for Edward. She stopped lingering over breakfast in hopes he might join her. She no longer remained awake in the library until he returned from his study late at night. It was the absence of those small acts that Edward noticed most. Mrs. Bell noticed it too. Her Grace wishes to donate some of her gowns, she informed him one afternoon. Some? Nearly half of them. A strange unease settled inside him. Then one evening, he entered Eleanor's sitting room and found her removing books from the shelves. What are you doing? Organizing? For what? Eleanor paused before answering. I've discovered that it's wise to prepare for unexpected changes. Something cold tightened around Edward's heart. Eleanor, you should return to your work. Your Grace. Again, that title, that distance. Meanwhile, Lady Beatrice settled comfortably into the routines of Ashcroft Hall. Margaret welcomed her enthusiastically. Beatrice joined family luncheons and afternoon teas, laughing easily as though she had never left. You've become terribly quiet, she remarked to Edward. I've always been quiet. You weren't years ago. His expression hardened. People change. Before Beatrice could respond, Eleanor entered carrying estate documents. Aren't you staying? Margaret asked. I have work to finish. You always have work these days. Eleanor offered a faint smile. Someone should. Even Margaret fell silent. That evening, Edward stood outside Eleanor's bedroom door. He raised his hand, then lowered it. What exactly was he supposed to say? That he regretted embarrassing her, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. The truth sounded weak even to himself. He had understood exactly what he was doing. He had simply chosen comfort over courage. 3 mornings later, Mrs. Bell appeared outside his study looking unusually pale. Your Grace? Something in her voice made him stand immediately. What happened? The Duchess has gone. For several seconds, Edward simply stared at her. What do you mean, gone? Her Grace left before dawn. He crossed the corridor faster than he had moved in years. Eleanor's rooms stood open, neat, orderly, untouched. The gowns remained hanging in the wardrobe. The jewelry rested untouched upon the dressing table. The books she loved most stood exactly where she had left them. Only one object remained at the center of the vanity, her wedding ring. Edward stopped, breathing. No. He picked up the ring with trembling fingers. No. Did she say where she was going? He asked. Mrs. Bell lowered her eyes. No, Your Grace. When will she return? I don't believe she intends to. Memories rushed through him. Without mercy, Eleanor smiling across the breakfast table, Eleanor kneeling beside village children, Eleanor defending him through whispered insults, Eleanor rising gracefully after he had asked her to surrender, the seat beside him. He had mistaken patience for permanence. He had believed she would always remain exactly where he left her, because she always had, until now. The days that followed brought consequences he had never expected. Villagers arrived asking for the Duchess by name. The schoolmaster requested guidance regarding programs only Eleanor managed. Servants hesitated over decisions she had always resolved with ease. Ashcroft Hall continued to function. But without Eleanor, it no longer felt alive. One evening, Edward's grandmother found him alone in the drawing room. You look surprised, she said. About what? That she left. Edward lowered his gaze. I never thought she would. The older woman studied him carefully. You gave away her seat long before that dinner, Edward. He looked up. What do you mean? You expected her patience and loyalty. You accepted her kindness as though it were endless. She paused. But you never protected her place in return. For the first time in years, Edward had no defense, only regret. A week later, he discovered where Eleanor had gone. She had settled in a small village several hours away, helping at a modest school funded partly through her own savings. The children adored her. Their laughter followed her through the schoolyard as though they couldn't imagine life without her. She looked peaceful, healthier somehow, when Eleanor saw him, standing beneath the old oak tree outside the school. Surprise flickered across her face before settling into calm. Politeness, Your Grace, Edward swallowed. You don't have to call me that. You haven't given me another title to use? The quiet ache in her voice hurt more than anger ever could. Came to bring you home. Eleanor looked toward the children playing nearby. Ashcroft Hall was your home, Edward corrected, softly. You were mine. For the first time since his arrival, emotion flickered across her expression. I waited 3 years for you to say something like that. Edward closed his eyes briefly. I know. You thought I would always stay, Eleanor continued. That was the problem. I know, he whispered again. I chose you every day, Edward. Even when your family mocked me. Even when you stayed silent. But the one time I needed you to choose me, she looked away. You handed my place to someone else. I was wrong. The words came without hesitation. I kept expecting you to understand me while giving you very little in return. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. You hurt me? No. You embarrassed me. No. And I don't know if I can trust you. Again, Edward's voice broke slightly. Then, let me earn it. He returned to Ashcroft Hall alone, but he didn't stop trying. He wrote letters. He visited the school. He listened instead of defending himself. For the first time in years, he chose courage over comfort. Months later, during another family dinner at Ashcroft Hall, Edward stood before the assembled guests. Margaret sat speechless. Beatrice lowered her gaze. Every member of the Ashcroft family waited. The greatest shame of my life was not the scars I carried home from war, Edward said quietly. It was allowing my wife to believe she mattered less than my pride. Then he pulled back the chair beside him, the Duchess's chair. He looked toward Eleanor, if you choose this seat again, let it be because you choose me. Not because duty demands it. The room held its breath. Eleanor looked at the chair for several long moments. Then she looked at Edward. Finally, she crossed the room and sat beside him. Not because she had forgotten. Not because forgiveness erased pain, but because love had finally been met with courage. Edward took her hand beneath the table. This time, he didn't let go. A marriage does not end the day love disappears. Sometimes, it ends the day one person stops making the other feel they still have a place beside them. And sometimes, if both hearts are brave enough, love offers one final chance to pull that chair back again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Romance Stories, and share it with someone who still believes that love is not only about being chosen once, but choosing each other again and again.